All right, it is 11:30, and so thank everybody for coming today. It's not that I don't want to sit by people, but I have influenza and I don't want to pass it on, so that's why I appreciate you giving me a little bit of space. And so we have 3 items on the agenda this morning. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and hopefully you had a chance to have some lunch, Mike, other than you. And I want to thank Greg Schildberger for giving us a roundtable so we can hopefully have a little more give and take, so thank you for doing that. So we'll start with agenda item number 1, JLG site selection criteria, attachment number 1. I don't know if somebody has specific, go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the task force. Just very briefly, we included in your packet after the meeting summary, this is your meeting summary from 2 weeks ago on February 12th. We did include just a very brief summary the JLG provided, just of some selection criteria. You're going to see this repeat in the Bishop Land Design presentation that's up here, and it will be the next presentation. But these are just some criteria to help us kind of guide our decision-making on adjacencies, on accessibility, on connectivity, various elements as we're thinking about these sites A and site B. And so you'll see this repeat, but I just wanted to highlight that got put into the packet. And if you had any questions about that, JLG is available, but will not be presenting today. This is really, primarily the presentation day for Bishop Land Design. So, thank you.
And John, I don't mean to step in on your
That's all right.
So if that's all right, number 2 is the Civic Plaza update, and Scott is here. Scott, if you wouldn't mind coming up to the podium, and if there's any questions at any time, please feel free to jump in. And so go ahead, Scott. Thanks for being here.
No problem. Thanks, Commissioner, and good to see you all task force members. Wanted to give you just a brief update. We are finishing our contextual planning phase for this project, which has a lot to do with some of the decisions that you are all hopefully going to make in a fairly short order. I think what we wanted to do today primarily was to talk about what some of those outcomes are briefly, but also give you a little sense of what else is going on in and around the plaza, which will hopefully help guide your decision making. And then also, as I had talked to you prior, talk about some of what we believe the possible futures are of the plaza and what that means for the Performing Arts Center, because each of them lead to, let's say, a different future. So in presenting that, hopefully we can offer some clarity on what those futures might be. First of all, just to give you a brief understanding of the contextual planning that, again, is the area that kind of surrounds the plaza. I wanted to point out a couple key things because they are questions that have been placed in front of you all in terms of connectivity. In essence, if you look at this image up here, one of the primary connections that we're looking to make is what we call the Second Ave connection, which really connects the Block 9 Plaza and Broadway to the plaza itself. And in essence, we also, I'm sure you guys have talked about connections via the Skywalk to what we're calling right now the potential development site, which you see on the southeast corner, which we'll go through in more detail. One thing I would like to point out specifically is that regardless of what goes there, a connection to that, let's say a weatherproof connection, is entirely feasible to that particular parcel. So if that is a key and critical part of your decision making, I want to make sure that you understand that having a weatherproof connection to that site is also a potential. What you also see in this particular image are the potential other developments that are surrounding the Civic Plaza, and that's actually a great thing because what you guys are doing is creating development and a series of developments around a central open space, which is what we call good city making. So, and in addition, you can see the connections that we're trying to make to the river, which no one has disputed. And so just to give you a little update on that, which is how we make that connections via biking and walking to the riverfront. Currently, what we see in terms of the existing conditions on the site are really a wall that's blocking off the river. And that is not going to create the kind of connections that you once had to the river or what you want in the future. So we've looked at three options. The first one is a big kind of infrastructural connection, which crosses the river and gets you down to the riverfront open space. The second option is what we would call kind of a ferry that gets you back and forth. That could be kayaks or other boats. We just mean ferrying across. And then a third option was a floating bridge. So we had that discussion last time we were in town about which one of these would be a good direction, and in fact we found out that none of them were the right solution. So we added the fourth option, which is really the kind of bridges that you build across the river here in your open spaces, which are lift bridges. And so that connection, along with the new connection that goes over Second, helps to expand and create that open space network. Again, Broadway, Block 9, down Second, and making that kind of big connection to the riverfront. So that's a key and critical part of the Civic Plaza, which I think makes it an important place to think about in terms of development potential. Specifically, we connect to the pedestrian ways that already exist along the river, and increasing greater use, which again increase safety. The connection is really quite interesting in that we are really extending Second Avenue down and across. So that alignment is also critical and something that helps us formulate where the development parcels are. And in essence, it creates this kind of new connection and system to Moorhead, again, which you see in this particular image. More specifically, we want to reinforce the connection that also exists on the First Avenue Bridge. And so in doing that, there's plenty of bandwidth that currently exists on that bridge. What we think is important is to actually create an amenity. So how are we going to improve that specific condition in order to get people to cross, thus kind of making the connections necessary. Within this, we also did talk a little bit about an interim option. Obviously, bridges take a little bit of time for funding, so there may be ways that we look at we would say an interim dock condition, which would allow, again, for not like a big, huge ferry, because it's not a big, huge river crossing, but potentially even just kayaks or smaller boats that can shuttle you from one side to the next. Are there any questions on that? I mean, I'm just trying to give you guys some understanding of the context of what we're all doing here. Good? Okay, awesome. All right. So let's talk a little bit about these development scenarios. I think we can discuss these kind of as we go through them. If you guys have questions, if you don't pipe up, we'll just go through all three of them, and then we can have a discussion after that. I think it's kind of critical that we look at these potentially and field whatever questions that I can help you guys out with. This is our existing condition, so this is what we know is going to happen. And kind of you can see, obviously, the library, the Civic Center, City Hall, some of those other elements like the flood wall, which are things that we want to deal with. We talked a little bit about the pump house prior, and what we did learn about the pump house is while it is difficult to work around, it is something that could potentially be integrated into a structure. So that's a little bit different from what we talked about in terms of setbacks and what you saw in the previous iteration. And then also we're looking at, and I know, for example, that you guys have made it fairly clear that the Mid-America Steel site is not ideal. But for best practice, I'm going to show that as a foil for you all today so that you understand that you are on the right path for decision making. But that's kind of in play for today. Each of these sites actually has a series of regulatory setbacks, which is another driver that we look at. And so obviously that does impact a series of sites, but it also impacts the elevation And that's also another critical thing to understand about whatever development happens in the southeast corner, is that you will be raising that above to the same elevation as City Hall. So that does actually create what we would call a plinth condition and allows for potential parking and logistics circulation to occur underneath the plaza itself. So parking under the park, so to speak. So today, and again, these two setbacks are the 100-year floodplain. The other one is the disturbance zone, which we really want to kind of stay away from. And you can see it kind of skirts that southeast corner edge, but they would call this a bit of a blurry line. As you can see how City Hall kind of hung over that. So there is some a bit of blurry in terms of what that means. So the three options, again, are the Civic Center, the southeast corner, and the Mid-America site for the Performing Arts Center alternatives. All right, and I know, again, you guys have discussed at length, I think, the fact that the Mid-America site's not ideal, and in fact, we actually agree with that. So site option A really looks at the Civic Center option. And again, we're going to look at these in terms of what we believe the future development potential is. These, in essence, have been discussed and vetted with the downtown plan, and we've been working with Scott Page from Interface to work through these development options. And this is kind of the direction that we see it going based upon the best knowledge that we have in terms of knowing that plan and what we know today. So this particular option would place the Performing Arts Center where the Civic Center is. You can see that there's a series of mixed-use development sites that surround the plaza. And there's current developments like City Center and Block 9. We have two potential development sites, one which is the police station, which we would see having a potential of being a hotel with the Performing Arts Center there, and we also have the health services building, which we would see is turning into mixed use. The three kind of parcels along First Avenue are private, and mixed use development would seem quite likely to occur as we had outlined in the downtown plan, the Fargo and Focus plan, occurring on the Mid-America Steel site with some adjacent development also clustered on the corner of that. So that's one development option. This one actually leaves an open space completely except for the Performing Arts Center. So that gives us the largest open space, and it has a certain number of benefits. One of the benefits, though, of having more open space, which as a landscape architect, I'd be super happy to go and look at, but as somebody that looks at developing cities, it's something that's going to cost you more. So we have to think about how we actually pay for some of these things. So in essence, thinking about that corner parcel as a mixed use site is also a potential. I think I want to be very clear that in this particular option, private development is not going to carry two things, which the other scenarios are going to. One is they're not going to really engage with the sewer lift station. It's a bit of a high-risk endeavor for them. Also, you're going to not yield super high density for mixed use on this site in this corner. Secondly, if you do get higher density, it's likely to be a hotel and hotel / mixed use, not unlike Block 9. The issue you have with that is that it would potentially take up as much footprint as possible in terms of waterfront to get its maximum yield, and that would be part of how you would deliver that site to that particular developer. So those are the potential kind of what we see is the likely potential options for private development, and neither of them really looks to engage the sewer lift station again. So that is something that we can talk a little bit more about in detail. What it does do, though, is it actually makes that connection, Second Ave, into the open space. As well, your logistics works in a similar way to what you see with the Civic Center at this point. So it's going to be on Third. As well, you're fronting the open space, which obviously makes sense on the Civic Plaza, but when we talk about that in terms of the Mid-America site, that is not something that occurs. So we've kind of created more or less a checklist about how these work, and you will find that in essence there are some pros and cons to the two sites on the plaza, and so they're going to be running fairly close in terms of site suitability and future development potential. One thing that we have to look at as well, and that may be where we kind of discuss what the future is what that means in terms of cost. One thing I'd like to point out with cost, which we've talked about before, is whatever it is that you put in terms of a dollar amount that you want to spend today on a performing arts center, that increases every year that you wait to build that. That's actually a fairly significant portion since that's compounded. So it would be 4 to 6% per year is what the increase in cost is going to be. So the longer you wait to develop any one of these parcels, the more costly it's going to be. And that's where we talk about in terms of cost, and also where is the money coming from in terms of public and private dollars. I think we all understand this in some essence, to be a public and private partnership. So in terms of site suitability, some of the things we look at is availability. Is this site available for development today? Because that impacts your costs. In terms of this particular site, it is not available today. There is a civic center there. Site remediation, there is some remediation that's going to have to occur. We know that there's asbestos in that building, more than likely, and so that's going to impact the timeline. Currently, there's not on-site parking, nor is that anticipated for the current option there. The other thing we look at is it a gateway, right? We talked about that. Is it something that's iconic coming over the river? It is not necessarily that in that particular location. With any of the sites on the Civic Plaza, we're engaged with some of the floodplain issues. It's unclear right now what would trigger the elevation for the Performing Arts Center, because you basically have some adjacency to the floodplain. It may require that you raise the entire building up to the same elevation as this building as well. That would create a bit of a complication. But that, I think, is for a later discussion. It doesn't have great river views because you have City Hall in front of it. It does have good accessibility in terms of pedestrian. It has the potential to connect to a skywalk, right, weather protected route. And then there's some other issues in terms of bike share and bus stops, but I think it's fairly connected to downtown, and there's proximity to parking. So when we talk about the future development potential, it's really about how we can kind of maximize that. And so that's talking about adjacency to commercial developments, residential, and hospitality, so food and hotels. And so that's kind of how we start to determine what that slider is. Again, you'll find that both of the plaza sites have a fairly good amount of connectivity. The one kind of big difference is the improvement to public infrastructure, right? That sewage lift station, that doesn't happen if you develop in this way. On the Civic Center site, it doesn't seem likely. Okay. Site option B is the southeast corner option. So what we did learn in this particular option was that we could, again, integrate the sewer lift station into the building envelope if we do it the right way. We can imagine that the Civic Center runs for a certain period of time while we develop the Performing Arts Center, and then that site can be turned into a development parcel. You get a lot more kind of density heading down towards 2nd Avenue with hotel and probably a parking facility. Likely, we would make a connection via the Skywalk to the Performing Arts Center in an underground fashion, but you would also have the potential for parking and potentially a Skywalk and what might be a hotel adjacent to the Performing Arts Center. Mixed-use development would occur on both of the publicly owned parcels, as well as a potential parking facility. Again, this yields a bit higher density than the previous option. As well, you could look to a variety of options in the future for the Civic Center site. One of those is you, again, create a kind of a larger open space that does create some issues for the connectivity to the Skywalk. How that might be done would require rebuilding a portion of that, which in any scenario would have to happen when the Civic Center vacates its current existence. As well, you could look at this as a future development parcel. Again, a bit more room here for development, a larger development, again, yielding more dollars in the future. If that's not what you're interested in, then you could look at actually replacing that with another civic center in the future, one that is not as problematic from an operation standpoint. Connectivity-wise, 2nd Avenue Woonarf, which is also what we call the shared use corridor. We make that connection. We still have a lot of bandwidth for the river bridge and that connection to the riverfront open space. The nice thing about this from a logistics standpoint is we have enough room to kind of get in and under the Performing Arts Center for trucking purposes. In addition, we believe that there would be additional parking underneath that, and it could extend virtually all the way to City Hall. So you will get some parking resources in addition to this development. So site suitability, again, these rate fairly close. It's one big difference is this is ready to be built today, right? There's nothing stopping you from starting that process except money, of course. The site does not need extensive remediation that we know of. That's always the caveat there. There is potential for on-site parking in that particular scenario. It does serve as a gateway to Moorhead, so architecturally it's going to probably have more of a presence. We still have the same issues with the floodplain. We are solidly within the 100-year, so again, that raises this up on a plinth, which I think we've discussed. We'll have river views from this site. It's pedestrian accessible. We also talked about the weather-protected route being a hybrid of the Skyway and a tunnel coming through City Hall. And you also have proximity to parking, of course, a little bit farther from Broadway, but you still have proximity to 2nd Avenue, which we're looking at certainly activating. A lot of potential for adjacent commercial developments, as well as residential and hotel, as we've shown. You will have access to the river trail a bit closer. Again, they both have fair amount of access. And another key and critical point is that you have the improvement of public infrastructure. And so that, I think we'll talk a little bit more. The construction timeline, it could be as soon as, again, as soon as you raise money, which from typically how money is raised is a 0 to 3 year timeline, which I hope you all would think about targeting. And it would be a combination of public and private dollars, obviously because of the parking facilities and the improvement to the public infrastructure specifically. Okay. And then quickly, just to kind of as a foil again, the Mid-America site option C. Again, again, you can see quite a bit of development potential, although it's not as likely that development potential, because you don't have that direct adjacency, may not yield the hotel in that particular condition, but as well, you're kind of cutting some of the development option out on that particular site. So the yield in this particular option is not as high, and it probably looks at a much longer term. Again, you could potentially develop mixed use where the Civic Center is if you look to take that away, as well as some other mixed use options, but you're looking at a much more diffuse development. Again, likelihood of that yielding the same amount of dollars is not as likely. There's no connectivity to the major open spaces that we talked about, no real direct adjacency to Second Broadway, as well as the plaza itself. And so in terms of site suitability, it's not really available right now. There's a steel plant on it, which needs to come down. After that, you're going to have site remediation. You may be able to build on-site parking resources there, but it's going to be limited. So it would be a destination without any supporting resources. It's not necessarily going to spur any additional development in and around itself. So you do have river views. It's still in a floodplain, very constricted. The access to that particular site is difficult. Much more difficult because of the fact that the road goes under the tracks. You have a wall that surrounds that site, which is not ideal in the least bit. And so you obviously don't have any, again, some of these things are pro and con, but proximity to Broadway, no. You don't have the potential really for adjacent hospitality. So restaurants and hotels, as well, no access to the green corridors, and in essence, the improvement to public infrastructure is not likely to happen there. It's a much longer term, which means it's going to be more expensive to develop that. All right, so some things to think about while we have a little discussion here. I think these are the questions that you guys might want to think about, which is what scenarios allow for the maximum capitalization of future sites? It's hopefully a goal. Number two is what scenarios allow for the improvement and integration of the sewer lift station into the development? And what spurs future growth in and around that particular site? So the things to consider are, what do we think about construction timeline? How do public improvements tie with public dollars, and what creates private development potential, and how quickly can you kind of plug and play into an open space that we're looking to develop in the near term? Okay. Is that very clear? Would you like to talk about this?
I have a question.
Sure.
The federal, the new opportunity zones, and maybe Jim, you can help us with that, is that strictly for private investors, or is that for also public, and are all three sites in the opportunity zones? Those are my questions.
Yeah, all three sites are in the opportunity zone. The tax savings are really for private sector investment, and so, public doesn't have the tax liability, and so they wouldn't benefit from investing. The opportunity zone downtown does cause more people to look closely at downtown redevelopment opportunities.
Thank you. Any other questions? I don't know if anybody else has any about any of the specific things. But the main thing I'm concerned about is the opportunity zone. Can we take advantage of that? And should that be one of our factors for, if we use the current location, are the other locations going to be, to me, they'll be in the opportunity zone, and so that would be an opportunity for private investment in those spots. Wouldn't that be true?
Yeah, I think, as Scott mentioned, each of the sites has different amounts of private development potential.
Right.
That could be created because of the Performing Arts Center. The other fact, the city does a good job with the Civic Plaza, that may itself encourage more development along the river, because there's an amenity there. And I know we're not getting into that right now, but that's another factor to consider, is how that Civic Plaza is developed may encourage more private development in the area, especially housing or hotels.
Any other questions for Scott? Letting you off very easy today, Scott.
Scott,
guess so,
you know
yeah.
what?
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I do have a question.
Sure.
So in your questions, you ask what spurs development of the sewer pumped station, I think is what best delivers that.
Yeah.
It seems like you're maybe feeling that the public or a public type of building is the best case scenario for that. I
Yes.
mean, could you dig in a little deeper into that? Or
I can. I think that's, regardless of whether or not you guys had questions, I was going to also just elaborate a little bit more on that. So one thing to understand is, right, developer risk, and that's going to drive certain factors in terms of the scale of the development, which is honestly how much money you get in terms of tax rolls, as well as what they're willing to do. So in each of those scenarios that we looked at, the Civic Center site as a performing arts center, then those two private developments are going to stay away from that sewer lift station. It's a big risk. And the reason why that's a risk is because it's public infrastructure. That, by the way, can't really be moved. That is in a location where it has to be in terms of gravity, and to move that would basically require rewiring the sewer for the entire downtown, which is totally not within your budget. So that has to be there. It's not a great amenity for the plaza, nor would it be for a developer. You have some of these around and people stay quite far away from them. If that had to be serviced, it requires a certain amount of machinery, and that also, right, is a certain amount of risk for a private developer. If you look at, in opposition to that, the Performing Arts Center taking on that risk as a public building, that risk, because you're going to have access that's always going to be supplied to the city because it's a public building. As well, you will not have any coordination or communication issues as you would with a private developer, and gaining access or potential issues with that, whether that's just nuisance, smell, site, et cetera, or if that's actual emergency and logistics, because all of that's going to be taken on by the city. This is why you don't see private bridges, right? Public infrastructure is necessary in order to make improvements to public infrastructure. It's the nature of how these things are done. And so I think that is one of the strongest cases for looking at that corner, is the ability to make that particular improvement, as well as the potential for that to be developed sooner rather than later. Not to say that those aren't costs that you incur, but if you want to get that done, it's probably the only pathway to do so. And it's likely to help out in terms of how you structure a parking facility in that location as well. Right, all of those things are much easier coordinated between one particular body rather than several in terms of private and public.
Mr. Chairman, if I could ask, this is more city-related question. I don't know, Mike, if you'd be the one to answer it, but with a new city hall, and I understand the police station may be vacated, the health center is no longer a health center. What's the plan for those two buildings?
Jim and I can address that question. These are land opportunities for redevelopment to leverage, as Scott is suggesting, either into a new facility that's public, made available to other private parties. You know, the city center lofts project is a good example of that as well. You had a diversion authority project that purchased the Howard Johnson and then made available a development opportunity after 2nd Street was realigned. So it is a resale opportunity, is the short answer. Jim?
I think also they'll be vacated by the end of September. The health building, as kind of the police detectives are on the 2nd floor and then the police station, but they plan to be into the new headquarters by September, I think at the very latest. So at that point, those would be the city commission will be able to decide, you know, how soon we move forward with RFPs for redevelopment of those sites.
Charlie.
I don't really know how I want to phrase this. Are we going to let the pump station be that big a factor in deciding where this goes?
Well, if you were letting the Skywalk be that factor, I would also say were there other factors, I guess, that you were
Charlie,
thinking?
I can try to answer that. I mean, all the sanitary sewer lines flow downhill to that point, and so,
Well, I'm not saying move it. I'm just saying, does it have to be that big a factor in what we build? Because I still don't necessarily see the proximity factors being as good in that site as they are over in the existing site. That's what I'm saying. I mean,
Assume it is this way. I mean, I'm trying to give you an understanding why that would be potentially a better site. You have a larger footprint of developable space if you move the Performing Arts Center to that southeast corner, because no one's going to develop around that lift station from a private aspect. So you basically get a higher yield of development, which is a higher yield of tax dollars. So that's one aspect. I think the fact is that you will drive development to that corner. So it being nowhere is a temporary thing. Right? Because if you have a hotel and restaurants right next to it, because the Performing Arts Center is on the southeast corner, it's no longer nowhere. It's actually somewhere to go, right? That's just how you think about it. So instead of grabbing what might be the low-hanging fruit for that Performing Arts Center, you actually use it to drive development elsewhere. And if public dollars are going into that, that's kind of what you want to do, is make improvements that improve that condition elsewhere. The lift station's not going to go away under private development. So then it's going to be on the plaza, which diminishes that potential in terms of it having more space and potentially more ideal space. Not that we can't design something that might help to ameliorate it, but we can't do that as easily as a Performing Arts Center would be able to do. So that decision actually, it's not just a pump station decision, it's actually about yield of development and how that gets done and how you expand potential future development.
How do you feel about the potential reuses of the Civic Center? Potential free repurposes or new purposes or new future? Or
I mean, I would not say that that's my expertise per se. I mean, we've had several discussions about how that could last for upward of 10 years. I do understand that there's been a fair amount of investments made to HVAC and other aspects of that in what would be the near term. We also talked about this last go around, which is the fact that you, within this particular site, have the Prairie Public infrastructure, which will also kind of start to delay that timeline. No matter what, even if it's as simple as moving it, it's still moving it, which requires some logistics. So I think that there is a timeline. I think you try to make it as useful as you can for what you believe that timeline to be. I think we talked about 10 years. It could be 7 years. It could be 5 years. It's going to kind of depend on other folks' expertise and what needs to be done in terms of getting, like, how do you want to invest $3 million to upgrade it, or do you want to invest $10 million? And that may have, that may relate to the duration of what that means, and especially in terms of what that program might be.
Mr. Chairman. So I understand what you're saying about how Site B, you know, these all have kind of long-term ripple effects on further potential development. And, you know, I don't think we're really talking about pump station versus skywalk, skyways, you know, which is going to be seems like an outsized driver. The questions that come to mind when I look at this are, it seems like A is unarguably closer to what already exists. It's closer to the amenities, restaurants, parking, skyway, all those things that already exist. Making the case for B, I understand you would enhance the future developability of where the Civic Center is now. You would make something happen on that corner that might not ever happen otherwise because of the lift station. But it seems, and I might not be seeing this correctly or understanding what some future parking plans are, but does B depend more than A on future unknown parking? Like, are we dependent on a hotel going in across the street, which is already going to have its own parking full because people check in and they park there in the evening and overnight? What are the parking conversations now and in the future?
We will talk about parking next. Jim has provided just kind of a high-level summary of where we think the needs are going to be on a 2,500-seat space. And so whether you put it here or put it elsewhere, to your question directly, there has not been that level of development about if you were on B, do you have enough right within, you know, a quick 500 feet? We're not to that level of detail, but we do know kind of what some of the other capacities are. We clearly have access here at City Center, at the City Hall property itself, and a couple of other locations, but that would be kind of a next level of design work I think that we would need to get to.
Yeah, I think the scale, and I'm fairly sure that it is something that does need to be looked at in terms of the option B or even the option A in terms of putting parking in that southeast corner, the extent of which is still to be determined, because that's not structured parking built on surface, that's a hybrid of structure and not structure. So again, if you park at the park, we could put parking under the entire Civic Plaza, and you could go down 4 stories, but that is an extremely expensive proposal. So there's a balance there that we're looking to accomplish, and that's the best insight that I can give you in terms of that.
Any other questions?
Commissioner, one more.
Yes, sir.
So I had thought that there was going to need to be a lot of dirt work done in Site B of like 7 to 8 feet worth to bring it up to the same level as the
That
city.
would be consistent with any foundation that would occur there. So regardless, it's the same condition that occurred here. So there is some, what would be urban fill. They did not find anything like highly contaminated when they did the excavations for this building. So again, we have not done any geotechnical or environmental explorations. So for me to say that it's super great and clean would not be right, but what we understand is that it would be a similar condition just based upon what we know for this building.
Charlie.
Well, the only thing other thing I'd say about that was I guess I didn't understand coming into this that the idea was to develop the entire, all 4 corners of that. At one point, I thought maybe we were talking about having the plaza extend down to that corner, which would provide some different access, maybe sloping access to the river. I mean, if you're going to develop something there, sure. I mean, it just depends on how long-term you want to look at it, I guess. I understand what you're saying about wanting to spur more development on that end of downtown, but I also understand Linda's argument that if you put it where the Civic Auditorium is now, it's closer to what exists and is eminently more walkable sooner from different locations where people might go. And how soon there'll be another hotel developed downtown after Block 9 is a big question mark, because hotel rooms are currently overbuilt, so, I don't know how soon that's going to happen, any way you cut it, including where the police station is, but there'd be some kind of development there. Those are just things that go through my head.
Any other questions?
So when you're talking about the Civic Center location, are we to assume that you're looking to demolish and build new? Or is that a different discussion entirely?
That would be a long-term option for the Civic Center site. Again, that doesn't yield you any dollars in terms of tax revenue, if that's a public building. But it is an option, just as I think Charlie has stated, keeping the site open is also an option. It's just what you yield on that. And so that's part of the equation, I think, for any city. I do think that in terms of next steps, it would to try to understand if Site B still remains an option for you all, that that pro forma would need to be looked at in the same way that it has been for Site A, because it's a little bit different configuration.
Linda?
Just to answer your question with an anecdote, when we were doing the library, if you'll recall, the first plan we moved forward with was to retrofit it, and it came back much more expensive than to demolish it and build new. And I would certainly imagine that a performing arts center with much more complex technical needs would be even more difficult to retrofit into an existing old building. I think we would certainly be looking at demolishing it and starting fresh.
Yeah, I may have answered that wrong. I thought you meant long-term redevelopment of the Civic Center into the Civic Center, not into the Performing Arts Center. I think that you guys had determined that it would be a new structure. Yeah, okay. Sorry if I
guess where my head is at is I just want to rule out, is there a good use of the Civic going forward as an asset that people already own? And I want to exhaust all avenues of exploration there to know that we've really vetted that, and there are options or there aren't. And because that's critical to me, if we have a future use of that existing facility or not. If we do, I'm in favor of B. If we go down the path and say we just don't see any viability of anything for the Civic Center building as it exists now, then I think we deal with that reality. But I would like to exhaust those avenues of exploration for that current facility. Is it fit with the Fargo Dome? Does it fit your programming? Can we expand it? Is there another community use potentially for it that would be viable? And as soon as I've got that question answered, it's a lot easier for me about where we go with aiming for a performing arts center.
Any other comments or questions? Otherwise, I think we'll have to keep moving on. We have 3 more things on our agenda, so thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you.
We'll move on to 3 reports updates from the February 12th, 2019 Task Force meeting. And 3A is the 2018 Civic Center events attendance, attachment number 2. And Mike, are you going to help us with that?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the task force. This is just a very brief summary of 2018 events that occurred in the Civic Center. Colleen Waddison was kind enough to help me out. Colleen, I believe, in the crowd today. And I just typed this up for you so you could see the types of activities that are occurring present day in the Civic Center. If you had specific questions about the attendance statistics or the number of days the facility was rented, Colleen's certainly available, but I really had not intended to spend any additional time on that. I think the thing we probably should spend some time on is Jim's attachment number 3, which is just a very high-level parking analysis of a 2,500 seat Performing Arts Center, what that looks like, and in terms of the access to facilities we have today, as well as facilities that we'll contemplate in the future, particularly the Mercantile property. And I'll just have Jim just highlight a couple of things for you, and then I'm going to close out in talking about Prairie Public and telecommunications infrastructure.
Thanks, Mike. What I did was take a look at the approximate distance of each of these parking facilities to roughly the front door of the current Civic Center. And for your reference, just is a drawing kind of showing at the Fargo Dome site, that's 900 feet. How, if you were going to be parking out by the sign, walk to the building, just for your reference. I think in general, people are willing to walk about, I think 1,100 feet outdoors is sort of a distance that most people are willing to walk, 3 blocks. And so most of these sites are kind of within that range. What I've got here is the facility size. The available parking, that's an estimate based on, if we look at the use of these facilities on a Friday evening, I probably need to get some more data, so we actually might have a little bit more parking available. The last couple of weeks, you, of course, had a lot of snow downtown, and I think a lot of people moved their car into the ramps overnight rather than parking on the street that they might normally do. So I'll just go down them. The Civic Center ramp is, of course, right across the street from the current auditorium. We have facility size of 150. The most we've seen there is about 150 in an evening, if there's a wedding event going on there, some sort of conference, or they have 150 rooms. So typically there's at least 100 spots available on nights and weekends. The Block 9 garage, our contract with them is that they need to provide at least 200 parking spots overnight and on weekends open to the public. The facility size is actually 379. Their hotel rooms is going to be at about 125. So there might be a little bit more than that, but I think 200 is a good number to use as an estimate. Roberts Commons, we have 454 spots there. Again, we've kind of seen heavy use in the evenings, recent weekends. I'm not sure how much of it's related to the snow or how much is other activity downtown, but I think we feel there's probably at least 200 spots there. That's 1,200 feet. But what I don't note here is that there's actually a shorter distance to get into the Skyway system. And when people are into a Skyway system, sometimes they're more comfortable walking a little bit further. They're able to access the Skyway from Broadway. This front door of this facility is only about a half block off of Broadway.
Jim, if I could just for a moment, that Roco parking ramp, do we know the impact when the Dillon apartments open next door? Because they will have connections and doors to the parking. So it's my sense they'll be parking there as well?
Yeah, there's 88 apartments in that, and so that I've kind of factored that in because again, a lot of weekends we're seeing only maybe 100 in the evening. This recent one we've seen up to 250 with the snow, but we have kind of factored that in. One of the things that's maybe a little bit surprising about some of the housing downtown is every apartment unit isn't renting a parking spot, which means some people there without cars, or they're parking on the street, and so not everyone is using the facility. I think these are going to be a little bit larger units, so we'll have more of them. But again, they're not often. Sometimes they're not likely to all be there at once, and so that might add some to that, but not that much. Again, that's about 1,200 feet. The GTC garage, that's about 1,200 feet to location A. It's probably about the same distance to the other location B, just a little bit different direction. We have 185 spots in there. Very little use at night. There's a few people who live downtown that rent spots there, so there's typically 150 spots there available. The city center surface, that's a surface lot that the city has leased immediately west of the city center apartments. There's about 111 spots there. We do have some fleet vehicles that I think park there overnight, so there's typically 100 spots available. at that location. It's 700 feet away, relatively close, just sort of a walk around the other side of the Civic Center. Depending on where the entrance is, it could even be closer. The other thing I did not include in here is that the city has 75 spots under City Hall that generally sit empty at night, except for a few fleet vehicles. We also have leased 100 spots under the condos. Again, most of those are empty in the evening. You know, under City Hall, there's some security concerns, but if there was a facility on Site A, there might be an opportunity to do some valet parking, or some of the staff of the Civic or whoever working the events might be able to use those facilities again on more of a secure access point. So there's probably some ways to use those. Maybe that becomes your a little bit more expensive parking for people who are willing to pay to be indoors. That's something they could consider, but certainly we'd have to look at what security issues there might be with that. Finally, the Parking Commission is studying building a parking garage on the corner of 4th Avenue and Broadway. We've kind of coined that the Mercantile site. It'd be a mixed-use housing and paying for commercial, primarily housing. We're looking at a facility size of roughly 350. Even with the housing, I would think there'll probably be 200 available parking spots. You know, there most nights and weekends, you know, depending on what other types of development happens in the area. So, you know, there's anywhere from 750 now to 950. I think Rob has indicated to me that sort of a good rule of thumb is parking is one spot for every 3 seats. And so if the goal is, I think, trying to get about 800 spots in the vicinity, that Site A certainly has that many spots within, you know, 12 to 1,400 feet. The distance from the front of the Civic to Site B is 300 to 400 feet, depending on, you know, where that front door is. So that's, except for the GTC garage, you would add that amount to it, it'd be another block.
Can I ask, and this might be something for future information, just there's some of the closed parking ramps that the city has, we could have for event parking, we could have a higher rate, and then is there some way that we could benefit from that? I know Block 9, that's their, they get their share of that, but we do too. So just for future information, if we could get the information, does that make sense to you, Rob? Because obviously at the Fargo Dome, the parking stays at the Fargo Dome. It's a little more challenging to get any type of parking revenue with the way things are in the downtown.
I think downtown we've typically charged similar to the Dome, $5 per event when there's been some things at the Civic, and that's what we look to. And you're right, you know, there is an opportunity for revenue when events happen. Our agreement with Block 9 is that if we're charging for parking, Block 9 can also charge for event parking, and the city receives half of the revenue.
But I just think it would be good to know. And actually, Linda, your point about having one stop parking, so people come and go to the event, but also go downtown. That's kind of the concept. So sorry to steal your idea. Go ahead, Linda.
And there is no parking revenue put into the performer existing of the performance center. However, go down to Target Center or US Bank Stadium, every parking ramp goes from an hourly rate to 10, 15, 30, and if it's a Super Bowl, 150 to park in the ramps. So it's definitely something that you could work out. If the city's operating the ramp, it's really easy because it's your staff. If it's not, you agree on a certain criteria and time that it goes up, just like they do in Minneapolis, and pop up the sign and say it's $10 or it's, you know, whatever it is to park there, flat fee, and the city could potentially get a percentage, but that would be to work out with the existing owners.
But I just think it's important for us to monetize that, so at least we know what the potential numbers are, and maybe we could have this at the Parking Commission just as a discussion as well, just if that's a potential thing. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Linda.
No, it's okay. Just a quick question. Did you say walking a block is 300 feet? How big is a block?
Yeah, literally probably closer to 400. I mean, blocks are 300 feet long. When you add in crossing the street, another 70 to 100 feet.
Okay, so we're talking, some of these are 4 blocks away.
Yeah.
the walkability in Fargo is much less when it's 20 below than it is when it's 70 degrees. So I think that's,
When you
No,
figure-
I just, going back to the library again, 80, 90% of public input had to do with parking. And as downtown gets more dense and we're talking about getting dressed up, going to an event, parking is a huge concern for the patrons we're talking about. And do we start talking about incorporating parking into this new structure? That we would use these spots, you know, that's not to say if there's something happening at the sanctuary or the Fargo Theater or whatever, that they're being used by other people as well. I don't think on any given night, all these spots will be available necessarily. What would public perception be if we're building a 2,000-seat hall with literally no parking, that we'd be dependent on what's existing and what may be coming from a hotel, and should we be thinking about, whether it's in location A or B, new parking structure attached to it?
any other comments? But just to go along with that, if you don't mind, that's why, so I know Scott's talking about all these different locations. To me, there's only one location that's connected to the Skyway, period. And if it's connected to the Skyway, it's connected to 3 enclosed parking ramps. That's, to me, that's a huge thing. People are willing to pay for enclosed parking, not having to deal with icy sidewalks, period. And the whole, it might sound a little flippant, but walkability, that's really nice when it's 70 degrees. When the sidewalks are as wide as your feet, people are going to be very reluctant. And so that's why some of these spots that we're looking at, I know we have to go through this, but I'm telling you, man, if you're not connected to parking ramps, you're being very optimistic. Go look outside right now. So that's my thing. But I do agree we have to look at all these to make sure we make a wise decision. But to not be attached to parking ramp. The other thing is it's 2,500 seats, so you don't have to have 2,500 parking spots, but we have to have the ability to have access for 2,500 people, and I think we already do. But I do think we have to make sure we're making a wise choice, and that's why we're looking at all these options. That's the end of my sermon for this afternoon. Any other comments or questions?
Hey, Dave,
Go ahead.
I haven't really tried to factor in, we don't have time to get some counts on the on-street parking, but I think you'd be surprised at how much on-street parking is within 2 blocks. And, the ROCO, it's 1,200 feet. Really, it's about 3 blocks, or 3.5 from Broadway straight over. And because you can tie into the Skyway, I think that would end up being a popular site, especially for the people who may park there, go eat someplace on Broadway, and then walk further over. So, and the other thing we haven't tried to factor in here is the private parking lot. So if, Gate City Bank has, surface lot real close, no doubt some youth hockey group will set up there and charge $5 and like they do near the Dome.
Say, Rob, I'm just curious about your parking issues and your future at the Dome. Are you folks sensing that with ride shares that the demand for parking will diminish, or are you seeing any of that already? You're not seeing that?
Anybody well,
Yep.
I usually disagree with Fargo, with people who say that the cars are going to decrease in Fargo, because what we've seen is everybody wants their car. So we see a little bit of it, but it has not been a significant increase with Lyft or with Uber, with limos, private car services. There's been some, but we still see about the same demand. What we see is in the warmer months, a larger, more pressure put on the residential areas with street parking versus coming into the paid parking, particularly in this market.
So
Any
in the
other
winter-
comments or questions? Otherwise, we have one more agenda item, and then we can always come back. But it's the Civic Center Telecommunications Infrastructure, Mike.
So real brief, we didn't put anything in the packet yet, because we're going to meet this afternoon, myself, Scott Bishop, and others, while Scott's in town, to visit with Prairie Public just about the communications infrastructure that they do have in the Civic. We did find the lease agreement from 1992 and 1993. There's actually 2 lease agreements for some of the television satellites that are actually just pointed to the southern hemisphere to broadcast signals coming in from Winnipeg. And so we're going to just try better understand the technical components to that. This is a technology that's been up there for several years, so just to try to understand that. And so we'll report back on that. And then the other piece that I did some preliminary research on that I'll also bring back in March is just the history of the veteran support. After the Civic got added onto back in that 2003, 2004 timeframe, I can find some news clips about the veterans organizations at that time being recognized for their contributions and the naming of the facility. But we need to just do a little bit deeper dive on some of that as well. I know that's been a topic of interest as well from the task force. So we'll come back at our next meeting, which is in another 2 weeks on March 12th. And then we're also going to get into some of the finance details. And I've been working with Kent Costin on some of the other local municipal financing tools and opportunities. And then we'll also kind of start talking about what a private campaign might look like for fundraising. So.
Can I ask one more thing for Rob for the future? The potential for, and what other locations in our area do with seats sales, like whether there's, I don't know what they do, and whether there's suite potential, those kinds are the potential revenues enhancement things. And maybe you have a few now, but do you get what I'm saying? And naming rights and naming
Are you
halls and
talking
things like.
for the Performance Center?
Yes.
Typically, you don't see them built with suites per se. You do have some theater boxes at times, but they're not necessarily subscribed. They're just an upcharge on that seat, if you will. Or you'll see different VIP areas happening now that create an all-inclusive food and beverage experience. Again, this depends on the type of show that they're attending, but I'm not completely familiar with the performing arts world as far as the venues throughout the country, but not very many of them do not really have suites, unless it's donor suites, owner suite, something such as that somebody who gave a significant contribution has access to a
But that's, I would be curious, like in Minneapolis and Sioux Falls, do they do suite subscriptions or even with seats, like a group of 4 that you pay a certain amount of money? Do you know what I mean? Because go
Well,
ahead.
actually, that revenue usually goes to the organization. So for example, when the symphony moved from performing at Concordia Memorial Auditorium to NDSU years ago, we literally walked around the place, decided we're going to charge this much for these seats, this much for these seats. And so the perceived value of a better seat is ticket revenue for the performing organization. Now, if you're charging rent as a basis on each ticket price, then that would kind of come back indirectly to the venue.
And I think that's what the discussion we need to have to find out, do we do something like that and then include the different groups as to get part of that benefit? Or I guess that's the debate. If we have to start figuring out how are we going to pay for this, and this is one of the potential revenue sources, which I believe it is, then you have to start looking at how do we do it, and how do we compensate the different groups that are using it. But my thing, so I think if we did this and you did that, it's just like Bison football seats. If you want to sit in the prime seats, you got to pony up right now. That's how it is. And then if the first couple of years you have fantastic Broadway shows with the varsity here out of the box and sell it out, that gets people fired up and will raise a lot of revenue and it will help pay for the thing. That's my theory. And I think it can happen. So we'll see what happens. But I do think seat subscriptions, that's how they pay for stuff. And I think that has to be one of our potential revenue sources. So. Once again, I apologize for going over my allotted time. Any other comments or questions? We have about 20 minutes till we're kicked out of the room. So if anybody has anything additional to add, but we'll be getting together again in a couple of weeks. And other than that, we won't keep going. we still have some food boxes up here, so if anybody hasn't had one, Mr. Mayor, come on up. Please speak into the microphone so we can hear you. And I would say, Greg, that's my only, the sound still isn't as strong as it could be up here, and so if you could bump that up at some point, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
I just have a concern about when we get into fundraising for the performing arts. I think Charlie was asked for $1 million from the park district, who's going to build. No, they asked me. I'm sorry, Charlie. They asked you for money. But I mean, as we go along, there's a variety of different things going on in the community. I'm a bit concerned if we don't start jumping in there, we're going to lose some opportunity because some people are looking for, you know, $1 million asks. We got Fuel the Future. Dave, we've been asked for. Dave and John, we've been asked for, I think, $400,000 for that. And if this is going to be our thing that we're really working on, I'm just asking you if we can kind of get going, because what's going to happen is a round of people trying to find money will take their money first, and we won't get it in our bailiwick. So, and I don't know when we're going to get to those types of questions or asks, but you know, you got the chamber out asking for money, you got Fuel the Future, you've got the Shields, or the, not the Shields, the Sanford Athletic Center that's going to be in the south part of Fargo. We've got academic, the People Academy going forward. So there's a lot of asks out there, and somehow we're going to have to figure out where we get this forward. So.
But I guess I have a question for you, Mr. Mayor. But to me, that's got to be part of this conversation. My perspective is the city, we want to be part of it, but we're not going to be the only person. And I think you have to look at all these different potential things, whether it's naming rights or seat licenses or what, that's all got to be out there, because we have to have that discussion at some point. So do you think, from our perspective, you're concerned that we are talking about that, or what do you think we should focus on? I guess that's my question.
Well, I just think at one time we talked about getting somebody into fundraising, working with you on this particular aspect, or doing an RFP, or doing something in regards to that, or show us something out there. I know you're trying to pick a site, pick a place, and those types of things, but isn't there a concurrent, what's the appetite out there? Because Dave, you talk about sometimes somebody might want to do naming rights. They may want to, but I think, and Charlie, maybe you know this, Sanford's putting how much into that athletic complex?
I don't know that I know exactly, but it's between 10 and 15 million, I think.
Between 10 and 15 million, and Fuel the Future, people are putting money into that. So I think they have 3 million raised for that already, or to almost 4 million, and they're asking public money of 1 million. So yeah, I'm just saying, Dave, maybe we have to eventually think about, we always have the question in the group, will the public support this? And it's always kind of that question. So all the planning we do, and then all of a sudden, whoop, I guess we can't afford it. It doesn't really work well for the group. So.
Mr. Chairman?
Linda.
To answer your question, Mr. Mayor, we had the discussion of hiring a fundraising consultant to do a fundraising feasibility study, and I know that I passed some names along. Do you have, I know that's coming up on our agenda, but what is the timeline of investigating the fundraising potential?
Right. That would be in March as well, just to get the direction from this group, as well as, I think, the elected officials, just to figure out, are we at the point where we feel we've got the site and we're ready to go start some of these discussions? I also had a good conversation with Travis, too, just about, in the private sector, I think, is going to expect not only the task force, but the city to just be coordinated and kind of have the plan, the game plan put together, so that when you get to the major asks, you get to that major capital campaign, it's in a coordinated way, not an ad hoc sort of disparate manner, but in a methodical way. And we're going to need help to do that, I think, to your point.
Well, and typically it's a two-step process where the feasibility study step is when the fundraising consultant goes to potential major donors and has a sketchy outline, but still fairly concrete of what the ask may be, and they ask, what's your feeling about this? What do you think might be a reasonable amount of support? They come back and report. Then, of course, step two is the actual campaign itself. So I think we're on a good timeline, because we really do need to have, I believe, the site and some of those very basic questions answered. Where are people going to park? Where is it going to be? How many is it going to seat? Who's going to use it? Once we have that in kind of even a sketch form, then you can do that step one of a feasibility study.
Mayor Mahoney, while you're at the microphone, you know, when the Civic, or when the Chamber had the mayor's State of the State cities address, and the new Mayor Moorhead mentioned that they'd like to be home of the new Performing Arts Center. For whatever that's worth, I still want us to vet that or explore that or find out if they really are or are not serious about that, and if they had the capability of maybe of delivering that or not. I don't care if a performing arts center is on this side of the river or that side of the river. I just want it to be a successful model for the broader community. And I'm not sure they have the, or not, the ability to do that, but I still want us to have that conversation with them to show them the respect of he threw this notion to us publicly. And I'd hate to not address it formally or informally.
Well, speaking of respect, I mean, throwing out a comment is easy to do. I think if he really respected what's at stake, Moorhead would have said something by now. I mean, sure, a phone call, but, I mean, we can't hold up this process
would like
just
us
to
to do
chase a
this.
random comment.
I think it's the proper thing to do. And Mike, you had said you might reach out to them or mayor, but either way, I just want to have that discussion one way or the other proactively early on in this discussion rather than not.
And actually, just to answer your question, John, we have all three of the mayors. We have West Fargo, we have Moorhead, and Mayor Mahoney, but as well as the superintendents of the three large public school districts as well to talk to. So that's on the list for the next round of discussion. So 2 weeks ago when we talked about that, yes, and you'll see that in the meeting summary, that we do want to spend some time there. Just as a courtesy, I think, as the chairman said, as a courtesy, what do you have, for a concept? So.
Did reach out to him a couple days after that, Commissioner Strand, and it's the same thing Linda mentioned, is he doesn't have the funding, doesn't have a committee, doesn't have a lot of things lined up for that. Might be worthwhile when you reach out and talk to people about that particular aspect. Problem is, we have a space that we can fill, and we have a committee that's moving kind of on it. So they would have to show due diligence if they had something different. My concern is, his idea was that the state of Minnesota does put some money into the arts, but I don't think it puts 50 million.
So just to cover those topics, I do care whether the Performing Arts Center is in Fargo or Moorhead. I want it in Fargo. And the main difference between the two cities is we have a vibrant downtown. We have bars, restaurants, we have people living. We're city commissioners for the city of Fargo. We want Fargo to grow. That's my view. He can say whatever. Moorhead would like a lot of things. They say a lot of things. This is our chance to do it here. That's what we want. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just ask, in regards to the response for that sense of urgency, I don't have the time frame in front of me here that we, I think, saw initially. What is the time frame for actually making a decision on the site? Right. I think some of us are getting frustrated with having the Mid-America still on the option or on the table. At some point, we need to finalize the site.
Yes, no, thanks for that. And after this presentation today, that's really right where we're at. I mean, is that site question, that's got to be number one at the next meeting. And to the master schedule, it was to try wrap by June, to get to some conclusions with this group's work about what it was thinking for sites, what it was thinking about for programs, what users were contacted, et cetera. So yes, this was just to try to give courtesy to both consultant teams to provide the same briefing, to this group while they were in town. But we're right there, and it will be in 2 weeks.
Very good. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I apologize. It's not going as quickly as we wanted, but I think it's important to be thorough. And so our next meeting is in a couple of weeks. So thank you for coming. Have a good afternoon. We are adjourned.